folks, thanks for joining me today. I'm Rob Hoyton and I'd like to welcome you to the Dragon's Teeth gaming channel. Now, as I promised in my introduction before, I'm going to give you a rundown of my gaming history, my my superhero origin story. There's nothing as exciting as getting bitten by a radioactive spider or anything else, but I hope for gamers of a certain age it will be a little bit of a trip down memory lane. And also, I'm not going to touch on it this time, but it is something I'm going to talk about in the future. I want to look at the difference between gaming back then, sort of mid-70s onwards, and gaming now, because I think there's been quite a huge amount of changes, mostly for the good. Some I'm not so keen on, but that's a topic for another day. So, we have to go all the way back to 1963, which was when I was born in East London, and like most kids of that age, or pretty much all kids where I lived anyway, we sort of grew up in the shadow of the Second World War. You know, it hadn't ended that long before, and obviously our parents and grandparents had very vivid memories. So in that part of London at the time, you could still see the scars of the Blitz, and obviously everyone had a family member who had served in the war in some capacity. Interestingly enough, that manifested itself in our play as kids. There are either two things. It was either football or playing war. Now that might have been playing cowboys or whatever, but normally, I guess because we all grew up with those war films of the era, it was playing some kind of Second World War thing, running around the playground with your machine gun, that sort of stuff. And of course, this was the boom time for companies like Airfix. I guess the technology had just recently changed so that companies like Airfix could now mass produce quite cheap plastic figures. So for, I don't know, a couple of bob or whatever it was, probably not even that much, you could pick up a box of 30 or so plastic figures, and of course you could get those wonderful sets that Airfix did back in the day. The Coastal Defence fort, there was a Foreign Legion fort, a medieval castle to go with your Robin Hood figures, all that kind of stuff. And alongside that, there can't be many kids of my generation who haven't built an Airfix Spitfire at some point. And one of my fondest memories of childhood is building the Airfix 1/24th scale Spitfire with my dad at one point. That seemed like a huge model at the time. And I think it's back out again now. So all of that sparked an early interest in history, in military history, and at the same time I was reading a lot as well. I was quite, and still am, an avid reader. And of course that included things like The Hobbit, Treasure Island, all that sort of adventure stuff. And then thinking back, it seems like a few things happened at the same time. I'm not sure if they actually did, because of course it's a long time ago and your memory plays tricks. But they certainly happened in very close proximity. So the first thing that happened was a history teacher at my school, Ilford County High School for boys, set up a sort of after-school club doing something called gladiatorial combat. Now, this isn't as bad as it potentially sounds, because of course it was a game. And this game took part in a round biscuit tin with graph paper in the bottom, and every player had a figure of a particular type of gladiator. I think they might have been minifigs, possibly 25mm minifigs figures. I think they brought out this range of gladiators at the time. And from what I remember, the rules were fairly simple, but of course you went in with your shield or your net and your trident and all the rest of it, and you tried to defeat the other gladiator. So this sort of opened up this whole new world for me, and I became aware of this thing called wargaming. And then two books came along that really sort of stirred up my interest. One was a series of books called Battle Game. I remember having a couple of these, but this is the only one I've still got. This is Battle Game 2, Knights at War. And it's got 4 games inside. One depicts a siege, one is a battle in the Crusades, one's a tournament, and the other one depicts, it's like a sort of Border Raiders scenario. Now, for the time, and considering, these are actually pretty good rules. They're fairly detailed for what they are, and we used to have a lot of enjoyment with this book. I think the other one we had was the World War II one as well. So that was the first thing. And then I was in my local Smiths in Ilford one day and I saw this very book, An Introduction to Battle Gaming by Terence Wise. This was first printed in 1971, I think, but this is the 1972 edition. And of course, what this did was take you beyond a sort of board game with counters into the world of figures and terrain and rivers and buildings and much more elaborate scenarios. And of course, it gave you a set of rules for all the main periods. This really was wargaming from the ground up at the time. It talked about the different eras and gave you some examples of organisations of the armies and some of the main battles that went on. It talked about the figures that were available and how to paint them. It gave you ideas on laying out battlefields, how to build terrain. This was the era of sort of paper mache hills and that kind of stuff. And we used to flip over our Subutio pitches, put them upside down with some books underneath. That was pretty much our tabletop. But this really did get me into the hobby seriously. And as I mentioned, that gladiatorial club at school, some of the older boys said, well, why don't we form a war games club? That led to the development of something called the Ilford Wargames Group or Society. And we used to meet on a Friday night in the church hall, actually right next to the school. In those early days, I was very interested in Second World War stuff with my Airfix kits. Of course, then at that time, we also had things like Esky, Bandai, Matchbox, bringing out some great kits as well. And the first rules we ever used were the Wargames Research Group, Armour and Infantry, 1925 to 1950. And there again is an original copy. But alongside the Second World War, I also had a big interest in fantasy. I'd read The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and about that time I started reading Conan, the Robert E. Howard stories, and from there got into Elric, Farford the Grey Mouser, and so on and so on. And what we started doing at the War Games Club was setting up these big tabletop Middle-earth battles. Initially we were using this set of rules, which were actually published by Skytrex, Middle-earth War Games rules, which were pretty good from what I remember, but as gamers do, we sort of from there developed our own homebrew, which I still have around on some sheets of photocopied paper with a little staple in the corner. And we used to have quite big battles. The War Games Club at this time had moved to a new premises. There was a guy called Paul Kesker who came in and sort of, I won't say he took the club over a bit, but you know, maybe in a way. Anyway, he owned a printing business that funnily enough used to belong to my uncle, small world, and we were allowed to use the whole upstairs room, when I say room, like a really large space, for the War Games Club. So that meant all the tables could stay set up, you could store the gear there, it was really secure. That meant we started getting into bigger and bigger battles, because when you can leave your stuff there and laid out, then bringing in sort of hundreds of figures aside is not a problem, you know. When you've only got a couple of hours, then you don't want to be spending an hour setting up and then packing away. So that was ideal. We started developing these huge Middle-earth battles. That led to a little bit of friction at the time because some of the members there, not all of them, were very into Napoleonics and took it very seriously as a hobby in terms of the history and everything else, which is fine. But I remember one or two of them started lecturing us about what we were doing was fantasy and we were just playing with toy soldiers, and what they were doing was real proper wargaming. And I remember distinctly one Sunday afternoon a certain gentleman lecturing me about the silliness of playing with orcs and trolls while he was doing a Napoleonic game and he was actually wearing a Napoleonic hat. So, you know, that led to some tensions. But that then leads us into the late 70s with the appearance, of course, of Dungeons and Dragons. So I'm not sure when D&D was actually first released in the UK. I'm guessing it was around 76, 77. But back in those days, no one had heard of it. It was very difficult to get hold of. There were very few wargaming shops. In fact, I should mention here the wargaming shop that I used to go to, luckily was local to me, was called New Model Army in Manor Park High Street. And that was run by Eric Knowles, who was one of the leading lights of early British wargaming. And that was where I used to get a ton of my stuff from. Most of my figures used to come from there, be they fantasy or Second World War or nav war boats or whatever. So that was a really great shop, New Model Army. But they didn't do Dungeons and Dragons. Very few places did, but we started hearing a lot of things about this game, which ironically enough had its roots in medieval tabletop wargaming. I think the predecessor was a set of rules called Chainmail, I believe. So it's quite ironic that that role-playing fantasy element actually had its roots in historical wargaming. Anyway, couldn't get hold of this, so I thought, what do? Let's try writing my own set of rules, which I called Shadle Manor. And again, it's something I still have. I unearthed this in one of my many boxes in the shed. And this was a very basic attempt to take known heroes like Conan and Aragorn, etc., give them statistics, and then pit them against various monsters. So quite a basic game, but something I really enjoy doing and still enjoy doing is either taking a rule set and tweaking it, or having a go at creating my own rule set as well. Anyway, eventually we got hold of a copy of D&D, so Shadle Manor went out the window and we started RPGing in earnest. That led to a sort of breakaway from the tabletop group, because with role-playing games you could get together around someone's house. You know, there's 6 of you sat around a table, you've got some beers and snacks on the go, you only need a couple of figures each. The DM will probably provide some more figures. Doesn't take an awful lot of time to set up. You don't necessarily need a load of terrain. And what I loved about the RPG and the D&D at that time in particular was you actually got to play as one of these heroes or heroic figures. You could be the barbarian, you could be the knight, or of course you could be the sneaky thief or the assassin and that kind of thing. And you go on these tremendous adventures. And of course we worked through all of the classic D&D modules at the time. The one that stands out the most was a very long campaign. I think it was against the Frost Giants, that then led into the Vault of the Drow, which was quite an extensive campaign. And I'm sure we went through a ton of characters doing that one, because that was quite a tough one. As well as the fantasy, I was also a fan of weird fiction, in particular H.P. Lovecraft. So in 1981, I think it was, we were thrilled by the release of the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, which originally came in a large box, which I still have some parts of it somewhere, but then there's also the 3rd edition hardback book as well. So this was quite a change, because Dungeons and Dragons mostly involved going into places, murdering things and stealing their treasure, and you could end up with, 95 hit points. So you could just wade through a lot of stuff without much difficulty. In Call of Cthulhu you might have 12 hit points, so even facing an irate zombie could be problematic. So a very different feel, and I think one of the most successful elements of the Call of Cthulhu game, aside from the mythos aspects, is that notion of investigation. It's as much a detective game as anything else. At its core, it's a game about investigation, uncovering truth, and that truth will slowly turn you mad. So at that time, we're into the 80s now, we were meeting at least a couple of times a week. We'd probably do one night RPG, then one night board game. With the RPGs, we've already mentioned D&D, Call of Cthulhu, they were the main ones. But we also got into trying Traveller, there was a Star Trek role-playing game, there was an excellent game called Paranoia, I remember playing that, things like Judge Dredd. So there was quite a wide range of RPGs going on, and basically if there was a film or book series that you liked, there was probably a game associated with it. And alongside that we were playing a lot of board games as well. Generally war type board games, so things like Richthofen's War, which was a World War I aerial combat board game. There was a big box game that I still have, War of the Ring I think, that was Frodo and the team trying to get to the ring to Mordor against the backdrop of the war in Middle-earth. And there were things like Car Wars, very enjoyable, and the main one I remember was something called Starfleet Battles, which was a Star Trek ship-to-ship combat game. That started off quite simple. I think it was a usual folder of rules to start, and it ended up, as it developed, we had virtually like an encyclopedia of rules, and there were more and more ships, and you could end up with these huge dreadnoughts and space stations and little fighters, dozens of counters all on the board at once. Very, very intricate games, but very enjoyable as well, very involved and very enjoyable. So if we move into the 90s, there was one last role-playing game that we started playing. We're playing for a couple of years, I remember, before I moved out of London. And that was as much a game changer for us as Call of Cthulhu had been. And that game was Vampire the Masquerade, in which the player characters are vampires. That again was another development, because now this was almost more like live action role-playing in a way, very much character based. Of course there were action scenes and fights and that sort of stuff, but the emphasis was much more on intrigue and interpersonal relationships. So a very interesting game, and again I still do have the rule book to that, but it sort of disintegrated. Quite fitting, I guess. I almost have the impression I took it out of its box one day and it hit the sunlight and it sort of crumbled away. So that's not really usable anymore, but fantastic game. So in the mid-90s I moved out of London. All my gaming gear got put in boxes. As it is when you move house, you know, things get boxed up, put in a garage and left there in some cases for years. That's pretty much what happened. So during the mid-90s, for the next sort of 15 years or so, I was not really gaming in terms of figures or board games, but I'll be playing PC games and of course the Xbox when that came out as well. So I moved house a few more times, and one advantage of the house here is we had a great big shed, or actually two sheds run together. One part we had to demolish after a few years because rot got in, but we've still got one very large shed. So, of course, all my boxes with the gaming gear went in the corner there, and particularly over lockdown I started tidying up and started unpacking a lot of my old gaming stuff and thinking, oh, you know, this would be interesting to get back into this. So I started bringing all the stuff into the house and sorting things out. It did so happen at the time I hit a bit of a financial rough spot, so I did end up selling a lot of that stuff. I had things like my old White Dwarf collection, Starfleet battles, and a lot of the supplements and the captain's logbooks and all those kind of things, and I did sell quite a lot of it. I still have a few bits and pieces from the old days, and then of course later on you think, oh, I sort of wish I hadn't sold that, but anyway, that's how it goes. So I thought I'd get back into it, and during lockdown I started watching YouTube, some Wargaming YouTube channels, and one thing that struck me was the idea of creating scenery, so hedges, trees, houses, hills, that sort of thing. And I thought that looked something quite relaxing I can do on a Sunday afternoon when it's quiet. So that's what I did over lockdown. I started building a lot of terrain and scenery. Then I started getting the figures out, and I tried a few solo games and everything else. I had a look around for wargaming clubs and saw there were a few around here, but they often conflicted with my work. Because I'm an instructor in martial arts and fitness, a lot of my work is in leisure time. Of course, people want to train of an evening or a weekend, so it was difficult sometimes to get the calendar to work. However, through my podcast, the Innsmouth Book Club, which I co-host with my friend Tim Mendes, we decided to set up something called the Innsmouth Literary Festival, which is going to take place in Bedford in September of this year. Part of that, we wanted a gaming area as well. So we organised that and advertised it, and then a guy called Steph Hoyle got in touch and said, oh, your festival looks really great, I'd love to come along. By the way, I run Call of Cthulhu games at Bedford Gladiators Wargames Club. Why don't you pop down one way? So I did, and I've been there ever since. So thanks, Steph, for that. And thanks to the good folks at Bedford Gladiators. It's an excellent club. They meet every Monday night. I'll put their link up in the notes below. And I mentioned before about back in the old days, there was this sort of tension between the proper wargamers, Napoleonics, and people doing fantasy, or even people doing Second World War stuff in some cases. There's not a hint of that these days, certainly not at Bedford. It's very interesting to me. You can have all these different things going on in the same room. There'll be a Call of Cthulhu in one corner, there'll be a board game in the other corner, someone will be doing Lion Rampant Medieval in the middle, there'll be a First World War dogfight going on. Someone could be doing English Civil War one week and the next week they're flying a TIE fighter. So it's really nice to see this mix of things, because after all it's all gaming, and if you enjoy it, that's the main thing. Anyway, that's my gaming history. I hope you've enjoyed that. Any questions or suggestions, please do let me know. And as always, if you like the channel and want to support it, please like, share and subscribe. Happy gaming!